Wonderful. Thank you, Leah. I certainly want to acknowledge that I'm zooming in here today from Midland, Ontario, which is the traditional and treaty territory of the Anishinaabe people. I'm certainly indebted to all the people for the land and what they're teaching us. So today, as you've seen, we're going to be talking about putting environmental equity on the map. And it's going to be a joint presentation with myself and Dany. And I want to also certainly acknowledge Eleanor Seton, who many of you may know, and maybe Eleanor is on the line. Call out to Eleanor, thanks, who's been extensively involved all the way along also. Let's go to the next slide, Dany. Today, I want to cover a number of things. The main objective is to provide an overview of the HealthyDesign.City project and the tools that we've built from that. It's also to put a call out for you all to experiment with it, because this is a work in progress, and so we are definitely looking for feedback to improve it over the next while. We're going to cover, I think, broadly some things around environmental health, equity in the built environment, the projects, how we got to where we are, what the current release of the tool looks like. Dany is going to do a demonstration, a live demonstration, and we'll talk a bit about where we plan to be this fall for a release and some thoughts for future developments. Next slide. Now, I think this is a topic, built environment equity, that everybody's hearing more and more about, and it's nicely framed and designed here by the BC CDC a few years ago in terms of the importance of it and the need to be thinking about equity as we're planning for our communities going forward. Next slide. And we know that these are real issues that affect Canada. Just a few examples here to think about. The BC heat dome of last year, it was noted from the team there from some of BC CDC about the significantly higher risk of death-related effects in the lower socioeconomic status groups, also experiencing less greenness. Montreal has looked at this as well. It talked about where people are and who they are in terms of more risk to urban heat and urban heat island effects. And in Toronto, sort of another angle here is access to a key amenity, which would be public transit, and how there are inequities and how the transit network is laid out. That can help us certainly improve going forward. Next slide. Now, it is even higher level in terms of what's in the news and what the thinking is of government at this stage. There is Bill C-226. That's a bill that's being presented within Canadian Parliament, talking about needing to develop a national strategy around promoting environmental justice and preventing environmental racism. And south of the border also, it's very high profile at the levels of even up to the White House. I think good examples are how it is throughout the recent Inflation Reduction Act of the U.S. government and the priorities that are set out in that, but also in Canada. Just I think might have been last week, the concepts were sort of raised in terms of how spending on incentives for retrofitting for electric heat pumps to address our climate mitigation plans are considering the inequities and where portions of the funding should flow. So it's in the high profile area. It's a difficult concept, I think, for me, because we're talking about environmental equity here in our talk, and we're sort of shining a light on that. And I think that there are definitely differences in what we mean by environmental racism, environmental justice, environmental equity, and even differences between how they're thought about in the U.S. versus Canada. And so these are things that we, I think, continue to think about where things fall and how they came to be historically, which to some extent is different. But here I think it's more in the realm of sort of looking at inequities and thinking about how they can shape our decisions going forward. Next slide. Now, we happen to be in the right place at the right time, that being CANUE and Dany, myself, and Ella Seton and others, leadership of CANUE, and thinking about how we could go from the type of research that we were facilitating, much of it looking at urban environments and associations with various health outcomes, and what's important, how they might interact, and providing the evidence base to motivate change. But that was sort of CANUE's mandate. But we were in the right place at the right time with the amounts of data we are amassing for research to do much more with it. And our thinking was come around how we might be able to generate more publicly accessible data sets and indices, but also then to think about how this overlays with the population, and how does it shine a light on inequities that might at the higher level point out where there are issues of how cities are evolving and whether they're truly sustainable. So we've been really acting upon that, and the first thing we did was say, what can we see with the CANUE databases? What does it teach us, and is there something that we could then take further forward? And I think that paper that we highlight there, led by Dany, was our first foray into this area. And Dany's going to go into this now in a little more detail in the next few slides. So go ahead, Dany.
Thanks, Jeff. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I am talking to you from the unceded territories of the Tla'amin Nation in British Columbia. So yeah, I'll take a few moments just to talk to you about this project and how we put it together. And then you'll see how, this was really the impetus for the HealthyDesign.City project that we'll talk about a bit later. So our main objective with this research project was to explore the spatial distribution and the intersection of walkability, nitrogen dioxide air pollution as a marker of traffic-related air pollution, and greenness or exposure to vegetation within Canada's 3 largest cities, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. And we also aim to assess how environmental factors are distributed across neighborhood socioeconomic gradients. So to achieve these objectives, we use the nationally standardized data put together by CANUE for the cities of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. So for walkability, we use the Canadian Active Living Environment Index, which is developed at McGill University by Nancy Ross's group. We used greenness from satellite, so satellite-derived NDVI data for greenness. And for traffic air pollution, we use a national land use regression model of NO2 air pollution exposure. And finally, to assess how these different factors, either individually or in combination, were distributed across socioeconomic gradients, we use the Material Deprivation Index developed by the Institut National de Santé Publique in Quebec, which incorporates Canadian census data on education, employment, and income. So the map of Vancouver that you see on this slide shows you where air pollution and greenness intersect with high material deprivation, or in other words, low socioeconomic status. Each dot on this map represent a postal code, and the dots in yellow are where high material deprivation and high nitrogen dioxide exposure coincide. The dots in orange show where high material deprivation and low vegetation exposure coincide. And the dots in red are what we can consider triple burden of low SES or high deprivation, and both high air pollution and low greenness exposure. This slide summarizes some of the main findings from our environmental equity analyses in this paper. So our results showed that in the most materially deprived areas of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, high walkability postal codes were about half as prevalent compared to citywide prevalence of high walkability. In terms of traffic-related air pollution, highly deprived areas were between 38 and 23% more likely to experience high air pollution in Toronto and Vancouver, respectively. And finally, people living in neighborhoods of high deprivation were between 23 and 44% more likely to be surrounded by low levels of vegetation in each of these cities. I'll pass it back to Jeff now to talk about the relevance of these findings and how they fed into the HealthyDesign.City project.
Thanks, Dany. Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think it's good to know what Dany has showed, and to some extent, probably we're not surprised. So the question is, what do we do about it? Does comparing the level of inequity across urban areas create impetus for more rapid change, or how could it promote that? And can this simple mapping, but done in a standardized way, help us move forward more efficiently? And that's, I think, where we've been heading, is in a standardized way, mapping these data. And that sort of led to the idea of how urban planners, public health professionals, and advocacy groups, and other decision makers might be able to really benefit from the data we've amassed in CANUE to inform policies and programs. So that led us towards trying to develop these tools. Next slide. Which was, again, a flow of the nationally standardized data sets that we hold in CANUE into tools that can make the data more accessible and support an equitable and healthy built environment going forward. Now, the opportunity was also made even sweeter from us in that it fit well with a program with the Public Health Agency of Canada called the Enhanced Surveillance for Chronic Disease Program, from which we've received funding to start to develop this. This is a multi-year research project that we're in the midst of right now. So it's important to realize that this is not the said and done tool that's out there, but it's still evolving, as I think Dany will also convey in some slides down the road. Thanks. Next slide. So what were sort of our main goals of this? Really, it's to map and visualize health relevant environmental factors for monitoring environmental exposures, spatially and over time, identifying locations where inequity exists, as shown in our sort of proof of concept publication, support decision-making processes that have more of an equity focus to them, policy design, urban design, intervention evaluation can be supported through this. And I think we talked about some of our different tools that we have. We can empower communities to take things into their own hands and facilitate that sort of advocacy, because information certainly is power. And of course, with information getting out, we can ideally increase public understanding of issues for their own personal decisions, or again, for trying to influence policy. Thanks. Next slide. So as I mentioned, there are sort of different forms to the way we're trying to make these data available, and they've sort of morphed into these two different tools: the HealthyPlace.City tool, the HealthyPlan.City tool. And maybe that's sort of self-explanatory, but Healthy Place, which we think is more of the tool that is a general public type tool, is to aim in facilitating the communication, public engagement, awareness, really democratizing the data as much as possible. And some of the main audiences we think would be more community organizations, members of the public, but also planners, public health officials, but a broader audience. The Healthy Plan tool, we think, is got more features to it. It overlays demographic information that were used in the previous analysis Dany talked about, and it's really to, I think, help drill down deeper to identify areas where there might be potential for more focus to improve, of course, the city's well-being overall, but to bring in that equity focus, which may be helpful in prioritizing where to start. Next slide. Now, our goal was to think about using much of the CANUE data, and you'll see what we're planning to bring in later in this presentation. But we couldn't resist the opportunity to get great media profile earlier this year with the interest from the CBC, who was preparing a series of stories around heat and the impacts, of course, coming from last year's heat dome in the West Coast, but you know, thinking about, okay, what's going to come this year? What might we want to have ready to you know, serve out to the people through the media? So we worked quite a bit with them, and that really accelerated us in wanting to fast track, you know, one component of the data and the tool, which resonated with the journalists at CBC, and that was around our maps of urban heat and variations in urban heat, sort of heat island measures that Dany will talk a bit more about, you know, what's actually in there, and the demographics and certain features. So we did that, and our timing, you could argue, was good, and that it came out in the midst of, you know, unprecedented heat waves in Europe, not to mention other areas. So that did enjoy a fair bit of attention. Maybe some of you saw that and can see, you know, what sort of ways the data were used and what was featured. I know a focus of the CBC was around New Westminster as one key thing. But other parts of the data have also been used, such as the air pollution in a narwhal article. Okay, let's keep going, Dany. Now, hopefully that's a bit of an intro to this. Maybe I'll have some questions as we get to the end of this talk, but Dany is going to go live now with a demonstration of ways that you can use the tool and potentially some interpretations. And certainly we you know, encourage you all to explore it and provide feedback.
All right, so I'll just share my screen again so that you can see the live demonstration. So I'll give you, so you can all get to this website. Maybe we can put the link in the chat. I'll get to this website at HealthyPlan.City. And so when you land on this website, this is what you see. As you can see in the upper left corner here, you have three choices, three drop-down menus. The first one is a city, so you can choose between 150 cities over 1,000 individuals. You can then select a built environment factor. So for the current version, as Jeff mentioned, our partnership with CBC Radio-Canada, we are really focusing on heat islands as the built environment factor of interest. So we have data on tree canopy cover and heat islands. As I'll show in slides in this presentation, we have plans to add additional built environment factors, which I'll outline. And then you can select a vulnerable population. So these data, as I'll show, are derived from Canadian census. And our tool allows overlaying the built environment factors with vulnerable populations listed here. So I'll start by just giving you an idea of what the application looks like when we choose a built environment factor. So if we select tree canopy cover for the city of Vancouver, what we see here is really where the dissemination blocks in Vancouver, where the vegetation cover is relatively high, and the dissemination blocks in red, where vegetation cover is low. I'll talk about the data sources in my slides, but I'll first give you a couple examples of how we can use this tool. We can then select heat islands, and we see the distribution of heat islands for the city of Vancouver. If we then select a vulnerable population, so if we select low-income individuals, what we see now are where these two factors intersect. So what we see are on this map are dissemination blocks where land surface temperature or heat islands are above the median, and the proportion of vulnerable populations, in this case low-income individuals, are also above the median for the city of Vancouver. So if we zoom in here, Jeff mentioned New Westminster earlier in the presentation. We can see that there are areas in Westminster that are what we consider equity priority areas. So areas where these two built environment factors and vulnerable populations intersect. You can learn more about the methods, and I'll talk about them in my slides of how these equity priority areas are calculated, but also learn more about the data that we're using for the tool, and then click on our research for more information on our future plans for both Healthy Plan and Healthy Place. What you see up here, equity priority by the numbers, are the number of low-income individuals in the city of Vancouver which live in these heat island dissemination blocks. The proportion of this population in Vancouver compared to the proportion for Canada as a whole. And we also included two other features in the current version of the tool. So a learning hub where you can learn about the impacts of heat islands on health, and then community stories. So these are really vignettes of municipalities or community groups that are implementing programs or policies to address the built environment factors that we're highlighting in the tool. I'll go over to Toronto just to show you another example. So if we're looking at tree canopy cover in the city of Toronto, so we're using the Statistics Canada CMA boundaries. So for each city that you're selecting here, it really is based on the CMA boundary. So if we look at the tree canopy cover and overlay this with visible minority individuals, we can see areas within Toronto where, again, a tree canopy cover is lower than the median, and the proportion of visible minority individuals are higher than the median for the entire city of Toronto. I'll just go back to the slides here to talk a bit more about the data and the methods that we have used for the current version of the tool. Here we go. So the land surface temperature data that you saw on the Healthy Plan tool is derived from Landsat satellite data, and is the average of land surface temperature for all of Canada between May and September of 2019. The tree canopy cover is also derived from satellites, and is the percentage of vegetation cover in 2015. Vulnerable population data, like I mentioned, is derived from census at the dissemination area level, but we downscaled this data to dissemination block. So each dissemination block within a dissemination area gets the value for the DA. We have children, older adults, lower income individuals, visible minority individuals, and individuals living alone. And the definition of each of these variables is outlined on the slide here. And finally, for the calculation of equity priorities, what we did is, as I mentioned, is we ranked the built environment data and the vulnerable population data from 1 to 10 in deciles. And what we're considering an equity priority area is really a dissemination block where vulnerable population ranks below 5 and above 5, and built environment ranks below 6. So essentially the areas where we have a higher proportion than median of vulnerable population and a lower proportion than median of beneficial environments. And again, darker shades of red are used to show higher equity priorities. So now on to some strengths and limitations of our tool. So main strength is that it's a simple tool to use, and we're using nationally consistent data. So this allows comparing and benchmarking different cities. And while we only have cross-sectional data for the moment in the tool, we hope to build in longitudinal built environment data so that we can look at trends over time. So exposure surveillance of different factors over time in different cities. Our tool is evolving, and we're keen to integrate feedback from users such as yourselves, as Jeff mentioned earlier. And another strength is the adaptability of our tools. So we can swap data sets and add new ones when more accurate or better resolved data becomes available. And finally, a strength that's worth mentioning is that it's freely available. So both the Healthy Plan and Healthy Place tool are free to use. In terms of limitations, the data that we include in our tools is based on surrogates examined from the top down rather than bottom up ground truth data. And I'll give an example of this in the next slide. We also, another limitation is that the data that were included is potentially not as accurate as locally available data. And an example of this is in the community amenities proximity measures that we will include in the next version of the tools. These are derived from OpenStreetMap, which are crowdsourced data. And so these data might not be as accurate as data held within municipalities, such as business registries for retail locations. Another limitation is the equity analyses in smaller communities might not be as useful given this relatively small variation in built environment and vulnerable population data that we see in these communities compared to larger cities. And vulnerable populations are broadly defined. So as I shown, we're defining vulnerable population as older adults or children, whereas we might want to think of combining different factors to give better detailed overview of vulnerable populations, such as older adults with lower income. So on this slide, I just want to highlight the importance of user engagement and how we can improve our tools and our data. This picture is of Gage Park, which is a large community park and civic gardens in Hamilton, Ontario. And when we launched our tool in July, someone from Hamilton contacted us to indicate a problem with our data. So as you can see here, the square here is Gage Park in Hamilton. And in the current version of the tool, it's indicated as low tree canopy cover. And the reason for this is that we extract the value of tree canopy cover at the centroid of a dissemination area. And it just so happens that for Gage Park, the center of the park is a parking lot, which led to Gage Park being classified as low tree canopy cover. We're now working with our data, our geospatial data specialist to average the values within each DA to give a better representation of the tree canopy cover across Canadian cities. But yeah, just an example to show you the importance of user feedback, and that we're keen to integrate feedback and comments to improve the tools. I'll now finish on this slide, which gives you an overview of the 4 data themes that will be included in the upcoming versions of both Healthy Place and Healthy Plan, which we will be releasing at the end of this year. So urban climate, I showed in the demonstration, we're including land surface temperature and tree canopy cover. But we will also allow users to map and visualize data on accessibility of community amenities, such as transit stops, educational and cultural facilities, retail locations, healthy food outlets, and cycling infrastructure. The Parks and Recreation theme will include data on accessibility of large green spaces, urban parks, and indoor recreation. And finally, our tools will allow users to visualize distribution of air and noise pollution across all Canadian cities. To examine environmental equity issues, we will include the following vulnerable populations, which I showed in the demonstration, and we also hope to include more detailed vulnerable population definitions in the future. So I'll now pass it back to Jeff to conclude the presentation and give some ideas for future developments and tailored applications of our tools.
Great, thanks, Dany. Yes, one of the criteria from the funder in starting this was that it should be built on publicly available data. And that does present some limitations in terms of where we started with it, but it is flexible for us to bring in additional information that will only improve it, and that could include, as we've talked about, information from the users. So that's much on the to-do list. But as we go forward, we do see ways we can improve it quite a bit in terms of, say, the vulnerability and equity. So, for example, right now you can either choose to map an exposure versus income and that area, or age and demographics, but not together at this stage. So these are things that are available upon request, and I think some financial support to improve that sort of thing. So we're kind of aware of these things, and they certainly are important to get down deeper into more aspects of the population characteristics. One of the things that we're moving into is more around the area of climate change risks and impacts that might impact health. And I would say that we know that probably the 3 big ones I think about would be clearly heat and heat stress and what that brings. And another one that is very important is the smoke from wildfires. Not to mention the wildfires themselves, but certainly wildfire smoke is in the front of everybody's mind. Certainly on the West Coast, but everywhere in Canada it can happen. And so we're teaming up with Health Canada, BC CDC, and other groups across the country to develop a more customized tool that will also be, I think, more useful outside of large urban areas to educate people on wildfire smoke, how to access resources, how to respond, and to make it more sensitive to that important climate risk issue. Another key climate risk that is of great importance would be flooding, localized flooding. Of course, there could be coastal flooding over time with climate change. We know now more and more how we see these extreme precipitation events that have major impacts on populations. They've been happening for years, and just a week and a half ago or so, one occurred in Montreal where a tremendous amount of rain fell in a short amount of time. Difficult to predict, but that has immediate serious impacts, but also lasting impacts. And these are things that can be mapped and that are data that are available and always improving, that we aim to start to bring into sort of more of the climate resilience, climate adaptation part of the tool going forward. Let's go to the next slide. It's, I think, very topical right now to talk about flooding and talk about risks. One big one that's just heading up the Atlantic coast right now would be Hurricane Fiona or Tropical Storm Fiona. that's likely to bring incredible amounts of precipitation to parts of the maritime provinces in the coming days, and how the population will fare afterwards, as certain areas are impacted more based on some of their physical features and where the rain falls, is a very important consideration. We've seen from hurricanes south of the border for sure how that intersects with the population and reveals even more inequities. So we know climate change really is a threat multiplier, and it's even multiplied more when we think about the vulnerable populations. So this is an area where we feel that we have got the data and some of the expertise to move into to hopefully play a role in making Canada a more resilient to climate change going forward into the future. Now back to another slide here to think about the big picture again. So I kind of thought that as we were amassing the CANUE data and thinking about what is a sustainable city, because I think that really is clearly our ultimate goal is for us all to be sustainable, for our cities to be sustainable, is that we do really fit into these large goals, and can help Canada at least be thinking about parts of them. Clearly, we fit into the SDG goal 11 around sustainable cities and communities by what we're doing, and CANUE has really been helping to accelerate Canadian research that motivates progress on sustainable cities. But in the next slide, as we think about HealthyDesign.City, we're clearly now bridging across the goal 11 and goal 10 around reducing inequities. Now, obviously, in the context of climate change, inequity happens at every scale. We can think about Canada and our position in the world and our relative wealth compared to other countries in the world, and the inequities that occur on that scale. But we do know clearly from what we've seen in the mapping, they occur in Canada, they occur at all different scales, and for an area to be truly sustainable, any city, for example, Canada, we need to be thinking about whether or not it's equitable. Because if it's not equitable, then I would postulate that it's really not sustainable. So there's a lot to push us forward in wanting to advance these things. HealthyDesign.City, I think takes us from the data and the research into really accelerating solution-oriented work by, again, democratizing the data and things like Healthy Place, but also targeting environmental equity. So that's a recap of sort of the two tools, what they're aiming to do. We're aiming to certainly mobilize CANUE data towards more solution-oriented work. So I think we all know that we need to move on to doing things about the issues that we know are here now and are going to be exacerbated in the future in climate change. And so ideally, as this rolls out over the next months in the fall to more widespread access, we'll get the feedback that we need as part of the research to improve it further and find even more applications going forward. So last slide, just to point out that we're a team of 6 at CANUE and HealthyDesign.City HDC. So I certainly want to acknowledge again Eleanor Seton, who has been very instrumental in making all this happen and has been with CANUE and HDC since the beginning, continues to work with us now. But we have a team there. You can see Andre, Alan, and Natalia that are also working day to day to move our softs forward. And there's some links for some additional information. And stay tuned for more later. We invite any feedback and questions now, and feedback through your playing around with what's currently live online. Thanks very much.